Inside Stateville Correctional Center. Just outside Chicago sits one of the most notorious prisons in American history. A place where the architecture itself was designed to watch, control, and psychologically pressure every person inside. A place that's been the subject of federal lawsuits, national investigations, and decades of debate about punishment versus rehabilitation. This is Stateville Correctional Center, and today, we're stepping inside its walls, through its history, its violence, its reforms, and the stories that continue to define one of the most controversial prisons in the United States. But to understand what Stateville became, you have to see how it started, and why its very design was meant to reshape the human mind.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
The birth of an experimental prison. Stateville didn't emerge during an era of modern reform, it was conceived during a period when American prisons were searching for a new identity. Construction began in 1917, and by the time it officially opened in 1925, Illinois had created something unprecedented, a fully operational Panopticon-style penitentiary, directly inspired by 18th-century philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham believed that a perfectly designed prison could control behavior without constant force, because the inmates would never know when they were being watched. Stateville's architects attempted to bring that theory into reality. Its centerpiece was the F-house Roundhouse, a circular cell block with a guard tower placed at its center. From that tower, correctional officers could theoretically observe every cell at once. For nearly a century, this structure would become one of the most scrutinized, and criticized, prison designs in the United States. But early reports show that even at the beginning, the system wasn't perfect. Documents from the 1920s and 1930s reveal chronic overcrowding, understaffing, and concerns about sanitation. Critics argued that the design created a sense of continuous surveillance, but not necessarily safety. Still, Stateville became a symbol of a modern incarceration in Illinois, a symbol that would quickly darken as decades of violence and mismanagement followed. The early years: violence, labor, and control. Through the 1930s and 1940s, Stateville operated under a strict, militaristic approach. Prison labor was a core component. Everything from license plate manufacturing to agricultural work took place behind the walls. But official records from the mid-20th century reveal frequent disturbances, including inmate-on-inmate attacks and clashes with staff. These incidents rarely made national news at the time, but they were documented in court cases, state investigations, and reports submitted to the governor's office. One of the earliest consistent complaints: the Roundhouse amplified tensions. The design allowed constant noise, shouting, arguments, metal doors clanging. Privacy was non-existent. Officers reported that supervising hundreds of men arranged in a perfect circle created blind spots despite the original theory behind the layout. By the 1950s, internal memos from Illinois officials reflected growing anxiety about the Roundhouse's effectiveness. Yet the structure remained in full use for more than 90 years. Stateville and organized crime. By the second half of the 20th century, Stateville became known not just as a prison, but as the prison for some of Illinois' most infamous offenders, including figures connected to Chicago's organized crime networks. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, multiple high-profile inmates linked to syndicate activity were housed here. While many details remain sealed or scattered across court records, archived news reports confirm that law enforcement considered Stateville one of the primary containment sites for gang-affiliated inmates whose influence extended far beyond prison walls. But housing men with powerful outside connections created a new set of problems. Confidential legislative reports from that era cited concerns about bribery attempts, smuggling operations, and internal hierarchies, though the exact scope of these activities remains partially undocumented. Still, the growing tension inside Stateville mirrored something larger happening across the United States. Prisons were becoming overcrowded, underfunded, and increasingly unstable. A national spotlight: the 1970s and 1980s. By the 1970s, America was in the middle of a massive shift in sentencing laws and incarceration rates. Stateville felt the impact immediately. Reports from this period described deteriorating conditions, persistent overcrowding, and understaffing, issues echoed in legislative hearings and investigative journalism. Some inmates were double or even triple-celled in spaces originally built for one person. Violence rose. Medical services struggled to keep up with need. Unsafe infrastructure, some of it dating back to the 1920s, became a recurring theme in state audits. But the most attention-grabbing moment came in 1978, when the U.S. Supreme Court cited Stateville in Hutto v. Finney discussions about conditions in American prisons, though the case itself involved Arkansas. While Stateville was not the subject of the ruling, it was referenced in broader national debates about overcrowding and constitutional limits on punishment. By the 1980s, Illinois lawmakers were openly acknowledging that Stateville represented the worst of a failing system, one in need of reform, but trapped by its own architectural and operational limitations. The penitentiary within a penitentiary. Within Stateville, there were places even more restrictive than the general population units. Throughout the late 20th century, news investigations and court filings repeatedly referred to segregation units, including disciplinary and administrative segregation. These units imposed near-total isolation. Limited movement, limited recreation, and few personal belongings. Inmate lawsuits in the 1980s and 1990s alleged inadequate mental health care in these areas. State officials frequently defended their use as necessary for safety. What's verifiable is this. During this period, both Illinois courts and federal courts ordered increased oversight of prison mental health services statewide, with Stateville mentioned in multiple filings. The conditions inside segregation fueled debates that continue today about the ethics and legality of long-term isolation. But the next crisis would push Stateville into the national news in an entirely different way. The 1990s, escapes, executions, and national controversy. Stateville entered the 1990s with one of the highest security reputations in the Midwest, but that reputation didn't stop controversy. In 1991, 2 inmates escaped in a garbage truck, a story widely reported in Illinois newspapers. Both were eventually recaptured, but the incident raised concerns about staff shortages and search protocols. At the same time, Stateville housed Illinois' execution chamber, located in a separate facility on the grounds. From the early 20th century to the last execution in 1999, the death penalty in Illinois passed through Stateville's walls. But after a series of wrongful conviction cases, including several involving inmates originally sent to death row, Illinois Governor George Ryan issued a moratorium in 2000 and later commuted all remaining death sentences in 2003. Stateville's role in capital punishment officially ended when Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011. These events placed the prison at the center of one of the most consequential criminal justice debates in U.S. history. A Prison Under Scrutiny, 2000 to 2010. The early 2000s brought renewed scrutiny. Journalists, advocacy groups, and state auditors documented deteriorating infrastructure, outdated plumbing, and ventilation problems, particularly in the Roundhouse. Legislative reports described decrepit conditions, and recommended major renovations or closure. In 2006, a series of Associated Press investigations cited staff shortages that allegedly contributed to violence and operational strain across Illinois prisons, including Stateville. By 2010, internal state documents openly questioned whether parts of the prison were still viable. These weren't isolated critiques, they were part of a pattern. And with the rise of smartphones and social media, stories that once stayed inside now spilled into public forums. Stateville was becoming a symbol again, this time of a system struggling to maintain safety inside aging, overcrowded facilities. The Roundhouse closes. The F-House Roundhouse, the architectural heart of Stateville, operated for nearly a century. But in 2016, the Illinois Department of Corrections announced its closure. Government documents cited the unit's inhumane design, poor ventilation, lack of privacy, and the difficulty of providing adequate supervision. National media outlets reported that critics had long argued the Roundhouse violated modern correctional standards. With its closure, one of the last functioning Panopticon-style cell blocks in the United States was officially retired. But shutting down the Roundhouse didn't erase the challenges inside Stateville, it simply marked the end of one chapter in a much larger story. And as the 2010s unfolded, new issues took center stage. A prison hit by a pandemic. In 2020, Stateville became one of the earliest and hardest-hit prisons in the United States during the COVID-19 pandemic. Reports from the Illinois Department of Public Health and national news outlets documented severe outbreaks among inmates and staff. Hospitals across the Chicago region reported an influx of critically ill prisoners transferred from Stateville. In April 2020, the Illinois National Guard assisted with testing and medical logistics. Advocacy groups and families of inmates raised urgent concerns about overcrowding, sanitation, and access to health care. State officials defended their response but acknowledged the scale of the outbreak required unprecedented measures. This moment, raw, chaotic, and heavily scrutinized, revealed vulnerabilities that had been building for decades. And it set the stage for new conversations about the future of Stateville. Life inside, daily routines, culture, and conflict. Crossing the threshold. For decades, thousands of people, officers, volunteers, medical workers, and family members, have stepped through Stateville's gates not knowing exactly what the day would bring. Inside these walls, the routines are rigid, but the atmosphere can shift in an instant. And for the men incarcerated here, every day begins the same way, with a count. Count times anchor the rhythm of the entire facility. Everything pauses. Everyone freezes. Correctional officers walk tier by tier, cell by cell, verifying identities and numbers. This simple act reveals the complexity of life behind bars. One incorrect count can lock down the prison for hours. One missing person can trigger a full-scale emergency. And at Stateville, where outdated architecture meets modern population management, something as procedural as a count has often been a point of tension. A day in general population. Most incarcerated men at Stateville spend their time in general population units, structured environments with specific privileges and limits. A typical day includes roll call and morning count. Breakfast, often served very early. Work assignments such as kitchen duty, laundry, or custodial labor. Educational programs, when available. Limited recreation time. But these routines have never been uniform. Reports from the 2000s and 2010s document frequent disruptions due to staffing shortages, illness outbreaks, infrastructure failures, or security incidents. A clogged drain in a decades-old plumbing system could shut down showers for days. A single violent conflict on the yard could end recreation for an entire week. The men living inside Stateville's aging tiers adapted to a reality where certainty was rare, and patience was essential. Prison jobs, labor behind the wall. Stateville, like most prisons, relies on incarcerated labor to function. Men work jobs that keep the institution running. Food service. Sanitation. Laundry. Maintenance. Clerk positions. Groundskeeping. Some roles pay only pennies per hour. Others offer limited incentives such as additional commissary access. Illinois has long acknowledged that prison labor offsets operational costs, but investigative reports show the system has faced chronic shortages of incentivized programming. That means many men wait months, or even years, for job assignments. Still, for those who secure steady work, a job can offer structure, time outside the cell, and a sense of purpose. But not all days at Stateville revolve around work. Some revolve around conflict. Survival and social structure. Stateville has never been a place where you can survive alone. Sociologists who studied the facility in the late 20th century described a complex social structure shaped by race, geography, gang affiliation, and shared experience. Inside, alliances could determine safety. Conflicts could determine isolation. Official sources confirm that security threat groups, a term used by IDOC, played a significant role in prison dynamics for decades. These groups were not unique to Stateville, they existed across Illinois prisons. But within Stateville's walls, their presence shaped daily life. Corrections staff responded with intelligence units, housing reassignments, administrative segregation, targeted programming. Yet despite these efforts, the specter of organized groups, large or small, never fully disappeared. Some former inmates, speaking to journalists after release, described navigating multiple layers of respect, tension, and negotiation. Others declined to speak at all. The exact internal dynamics remain partially documented, but the impact on daily life is well established. At Stateville, social structure was often as influential as official policy. Education behind bars. Education has long been one of the few stabilizing forces inside Stateville. For decades, programs included GED preparation, basic literacy courses, vocational training, limited college partnerships, depending on funding levels. But availability has fluctuated dramatically over the years. During budget crises, especially in the late 2000s, multiple programs faced cuts or staffing shortages. Advocacy organizations reported long waitlists and limited instructional hours. Still, when the programs were active, they changed lives. One of the most widely reported stories involved an experimental higher education program launched in the mid-2010s by a coalition of Illinois universities. The program brought professors inside to teach accredited courses. While enrollment was small, early outcomes showed improved behavior and reduced disciplinary incidents among participants. Education didn't fix Stateville's systemic issues, but it gave some men a path to redefine themselves within an environment built around confinement. Visitation, connections and costs. Visitation at Stateville has always carried emotional weight. For many incarcerated men, seeing family is the only reminder of life outside the walls. But the process is demanding: security screenings, long waits, strict dress codes, and abrupt endings when visitation periods expire. News reports and advocacy groups have documented persistent transportation challenges for families traveling from distant parts of Illinois. Some rely on volunteer-run shuttle services. Others take long bus routes or borrow cars just to spend 1 hour inside the visiting room. During the 2020 COVID outbreak, visitation was suspended entirely, creating months, sometimes years, of separation. Phone calls and video visits became the only link, and many families reported emotional strain as a result. Yet when visitation is open, those moments of connection can reshape the atmosphere inside the prison. Officers, inmates, and volunteers consistently report that strong family ties often correlate with fewer disciplinary issues and smoother re-entry after release. But for some men, those ties fade over time, leaving isolation that becomes part of the punishment, even if it's never written into the sentence. Recreation and restriction. Recreation time, rec, as it's known inside, is one of the few opportunities men have to exercise, socialize, or simply breathe outdoor air. Depending on housing status, men may receive outdoor yard time, indoor gym access, limited sports equipment. But again, the reality doesn't always match the policy. Staff shortages, weather conditions, facility repairs, or security incidents can reduce or cancel recreation. Some years saw far more consistent yard access than others. Associated Press reports documented periods where men in certain units reported going days, or in some cases weeks, without regular recreation due to lockdowns or operational disruptions. For incarcerated individuals, rec isn't just physical release. It's psychological. It's social. It's a temporary break from the confinement of a small, often aging cell. When rec disappears, tensions rise. When it resumes, the prison exhales. Medical care and the fight for reform. Medical care at Stateville, and throughout the Illinois prison system, has been the focus of federal scrutiny for years. Multiple lawsuits have challenged the adequacy of care, alleging delayed treatment, insufficient staffing, poor chronic disease management, inadequate mental health services. In 2018, a major federal court ruling in the Lippert v. Jeffries case found that statewide prison healthcare, including at Stateville, was constitutionally deficient. This ruling led to ongoing oversight and mandated improvements. The COVID-19 outbreak in 2020 amplified pre-existing weaknesses. Stateville's aging infrastructure, limited isolation areas, and high-risk population contributed to rapid spread. Illinois corrections officials acknowledged the severity of the situation and implemented emergency measures, but national media reports documented significant challenges. Healthcare remains one of the most complex and contentious issues inside Stateville. And each new audit, oversight report, or lawsuit adds another layer to a decades-long fight for systemic reform. Mental health behind the walls. Mental health has been one of the most urgent and controversial topics inside Stateville. Illinois has repeatedly faced lawsuits over inadequate treatment for prisoners with mental illnesses. One of the most significant cases, Rasho v. Walker, began in 2007 and led to federal court oversight across the state's correctional facilities. Although Stateville was not the sole focus, it was repeatedly referenced in findings about high rates of untreated mental illness, insufficient clinical staffing, excessive use of restrictive housing for mentally ill inmates. Over time, the court ordered the state to expand programming, increase staffing, and improve monitoring. Progress reports have shown gradual improvements, but also persistent gaps. Inside the prison, men dealing with anxiety, depression, trauma, or severe psychiatric conditions often face long waits for appointments. Some receive therapy in group sessions, others in brief one-on-one meetings. Mental health is not a side issue, it affects discipline, medical outcomes, and long-term re-entry. And at Stateville, addressing these needs has been a slow and difficult process.